Yeah, sure. So I'm Aaron A. Reed. I'm 40 years old now, amazingly. I've been making mostly indie games for about 15 or 16 years as far as stuff I've been releasing. And kind of my core area of interest is interactive narrative, and specifically what are kind of more unique, interesting, original things we can do with interactive stories other than just sort of, branching paths. Do you go left or go right? So really interested in kind of experimenting with what are other kinds of structures that allow people to be creative in the context of an interactive story, and kind of enter into something that feels more like a collaboration than just, getting part of a pre-existing story.
Gotcha. So yeah, this is a mundane follow-up, but just where are you based out of?
I'm based in Santa Cruz, California.
Cruz. Okay. So hopefully we can go from the more mundane to the more profound questions from there. So yeah, I mean, when I guess what feeling do you get out of making the games that you make, or sort of expressing yourself in that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think a lot of it for me is I'm always really excited about how people will build things in my games, or not always in a literal sense, but what's the sort of process that a player of one of my games will go through as they sort of come to terms with the game, as they go through the story in it, as they relate it to their own experiences. It's a lot more interesting to me to feel like I gave someone an experience where they kind of were part of a process of discovering something about the game, about themselves, rather than just, listening, being more passive. So the kind of like my favorite feedback on my games is always when somebody tells me about some experience they had, which is surprising to me, right? They aren't just like recapping the plot of the thing I made. They're saying like, I uncovered this secret, or I, combined these story pieces and made this really cool original thing. Because to me, that's something I love it when that's a two-way conversation, right? When I've made something that delights the player, but then they've done something with my game that in turn sort of surprises and inspires me. So that's really kind of the sweet spot that a lot of my stuff is aiming for.
I feel like it's funny because I was just thinking about this last night. I don't know if you've seen Hamilton. It's not really important to this conversation.
Yeah, we watched the Disney Plus version of it, so that was just great. Finally, see.
Inevitably, just like conversations breaking out about like, what, you don't like this song? What's wrong with you? I feel like those kind of conversations are. Maybe it's just the circles I'm in. I feel like that's kind of rare with games. Where like I feel like I've rarely heard like an articulate like conversation about like why X part of a game is quote unquote better. Maybe not. Maybe that's like a stereotypical like gamer conversation. But I mean, do you feel like is that a more common thing in the IF world as compared to like the broader video game world? Those kind of conversations, or maybe those are actually just boring conversations. But I was just thinking about these yesterday and how like, oh well, I feel like I hear this a lot with other stuff, but not with games. But maybe it's just me.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to that. I mean, I think in this sort of, art capital A sense, you're used to, having conversations about how do you interpret this? What does this mean to you?
Yeah.
Whereas I think like the default mindset for games is more sort of quantitative. You're talking more about like one of the things that is really interesting to me about how games have changed like over my lifetime is that nowadays, every big game will have like an incredibly detailed wiki where people have gone through and like squeezed all the secrets out of the game. Every piece of information about it is just sort of, quantitatively there. Whereas when I was a kid, video games were way more mysterious, right? Because we didn't have that kind of crowdsourced knowledge. So there were all of these, you would talk, at recess about, like secrets you found in a game, and there was this like sense of possibility that there could be like whole new levels or worlds or whatever, like waiting in like any random game if you were just smart enough to like figure out how to get to it, and sometimes you were right about that and sometimes you weren't, right? I think nowadays there's more, this is maybe unfair, but as games have sort of become more of an established kind of product, I think some of that process of like interpretation and being confused and not knowing exactly what you're supposed to do has kind of been designed out so that you get a more sort of predictable, enjoyable experience. But at the same time, I think that's at the expense of those sort of more free-form ways you can encounter something and you know, kind of have a more personal relationship with it in a sense.
Yeah, and I don't want to imply that, like, just because there's this thing, quote unquote, outside of games that, like, you know, that's better in some way or that points to something being deficient in games. But as I'm sure you've experienced, there are a lot of those comparisons you can make and sort of scratch your head and be like, well, wait, why is that? Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, with the games you make, I mean, I don't know if you think of it in this way, but sort of like, how did you come to your design ideals in making games? And if you do think of it that way, like what are they?
Yeah, interesting. So I started making games coming out of the sort of amateur text adventure community. So in the early 2000s, there was this whole, in the early 90s, originally, there was this whole group of people online who they sort of stopped making commercial text adventures. These people were like, oh, these are pretty cool. We liked them. We want to keep making them. And by the time I discovered that community in the sort of early 2000s, they had been having all these, amazing kind of conversations about, actually there's a lot you can do with this art form, right? Like interactive text as a concept can go way beyond the kind of, Zork level stuff that so many 80s games were like. And companies like Infocom sort of famously were starting to explore that those ideas, or games like A Mind Forever Voyaging that were, in a lot of ways. But when I sort of came into that world, I was just so blown away by the experimentation that was happening. So many people were doing all kinds of things that I had never seen games do before. Stuff with, point of view, and stuff with, just kind of basic techniques that exist in other more mature media that have been around for much longer, right? But a lot of the first time those things were done in an interactive form were in these little, communities of amateur gamers who didn't have to, didn't have big teams, didn't have huge budgets or shareholders. They were just, doing stuff for the hell of it. So I really came into it with this perspective of like, I think there's some new things I can do here that no one's ever done before, and started thinking about its possibilities, right, that I hadn't seen exist before. So one of my first really big games, which was a text game called Blue Lacuna, which was at the time was the longest, or one of the longest text adventures that had ever been written. It has since been much surpassed by people who are even more workaholic than I am. But one of the things that I wanted to do with that game is I'd never really seen an NPC in a game at that point, and this is like 2005, 2006, that I felt was really responding to me as a player in a meaningful way, other than choosing a couple dialogue options and then having things almost immediately branch back to the main path. I'd never really seen that. And I was like, well, text is a medium in which you don't have to have animations, you don't have to have voiceover, you don't have to have all of this stuff that makes that so difficult and expensive to do in mainstream games. But I think with just text and, some clever coding, you could actually come up with an NPC who evolves over time based on how you treat him. So the main NPC in that game, based on how you treat him, develops into one of these kind of 12 different archetypes that are sort of symbolic of his relationship with you. So he might develop into kind of like a father figure. He might develop into, a rival. And then the end of the game is really contingent on how that relationship is developed. And so even with just text, it took me a couple years to do, but it just sort of emerged out of this place of like, I've never seen someone do that well, and I wanted to give it a shot and see if I could do it. And since then, I think a lot of my games have kind of been sparked by questions of like, well, I've never really seen someone do X in a way that really satisfies me, but I think it's possible, so I'm going to try it.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it, like, because I always sort of, I guess, like, I'm curious, like, what you maybe are sensing, like, what is possible right now, or what is it that people are trying to make possible right now? Like I was going to put it like, well, where is the pendulum swinging now? But I'm not sure if these developments in games really are cyclical or even are a pendulum. So I guess like, like, well, what stuff you notice on the horizon that's like getting popular that you think people are hoping is going to be possible, or maybe what are things that people are hoping are going to be popular that maybe you're a little skeptical of?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting decade for games. I've been doing some sort of preliminary research for a book, and thinking a lot about sort of like trends and stuff. And one of the things that it's hard to remember is the iPhone and the iPad and a lot of those things are just just over a decade old, right? Like they haven't been around for that long. So there's been this huge shift to like a much broader number of platforms that games are being played on, right? From smartwatches, smartphones, AR and VR stuff, smart speakers, right? There are just all of these new places games can live. And I think it's kind of a bit of Wild West right now as designers are trying to figure out like which of these platforms are going to stick around, how does each one of them change, the capabilities we have as creators. So what I wouldn't be surprised to see over the next decade is that, some of these platforms will probably fade away. Like maybe we'll decide, well, we don't really need smartwatches or whatever it happens to be. And the ones that remain, you're going to start to get more kind of second generation maturity in what people are doing with them. So that's definitely one thing I see happening is that I think I could be wrong. I probably will be wrong, but it seems like it's been an unusual period of platform instability for a while. So it'll be interesting to see if things settle down a bit more as we move forward.
Are there? Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, not in a nostalgic way, but I wonder, because I think that's sort of like, a natural development of things, just sort of we move into the future by sort of synthesizing things from the past and also things that are going on right now. But I was going to ask, like, not in a nostalgic way, but are there things from the past that you'd like to see, maybe games scoop up or revisit, be it IF games or other types of games, or maybe a type of game you don't make but are interested in and personally fond of?
Yeah, I think games education. So I went to a PhD program that was a pretty early kind of graduate level program studying games, sort of on the sense of both creating them, but also sort of like how do they work as part of our culture and what can they do, and kind of the humanities perspective too. And this is always, I think, and increasingly so, been a big problem for game history is how many games become inaccessible, right? Like if you're lucky, something gets ported to a new platform. If it has enough fans, someone will emulate it and get it, online somehow. But there are tons of games that are either gone or not playable. And that's, if anything, that seems to be accelerating over the last 10 years, right? So that like early iPhone games is an example of a thing right now where it's like there's no way to run them. There's no legal way, to emulate them or save them or anything. And quite often in the past, as enough time has gone by, people have found a way to save those things. But especially with so much stuff moving to the cloud, right, it just feels increasingly ephemeral. And I think it's always a huge loss if, new generations of designers can't sort of like learn from the wisdom of what's been done before. So in the general sense, I think part of your question is like, we should be looking at the past. More specifically, yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much like, I don't know, not so much like certain mechanics, but maybe there's certain philosophies. I mean, I think you were mentioning something as far as like the degree to which you can have a player sort of be wondering, what it is they're supposed to do. And I think at least when we're talking about like bigger budget games from bigger teams, that's something that has just definitely been way, way, way sanded down. So I mean, if a mechanic comes to mind, great. If it's a philosophy that comes to mind, great. If it's one weird old game that comes to mind, great. If you don't have an answer, that's great too.
Yeah, something that does come to mind is the creators of Kentucky Route Zero, which is a game I admire a lot, had this really fascinating talk where they talked about the maze as a trope that was popular in very early digital gaming history and then kind of went away, and most people remembered with kind of annoyance, right? Like mazes weren't fun. They were obnoxious. But they sort of were talking about how, you know, what value is there in that? Like, did we throw something out with the bathwater there? And they talked about this really lovely metaphor of a maze as a machine for getting lost on purpose, right? Like it's a thing that's designed specifically to disorient you and make you feel confused and frustrated and afraid. And that's not the kind of experience that most modern games want you to have, right? Because, you know, if you feel any of those emotions, you might stop playing the game, right?
Right.
But they talked about this notion of like, well, is there value in creating places that challenge people in those kinds of ways, right? That ask them to try to find their own way out. And I think to a certain extent they were talking, or they were connecting this to sort of other things that we lost from 80s gaming, like puzzles, right? And from today's perspective, you know, telling a player of a game that they're too stupid to keep playing is like business suicide, right? Like, why would you ever do that? But for 15 years, like that was a huge, you know, dominant model in games, or that was a successful genre. So what did we lose when we got rid of puzzles, right, in modern games? So I think there are things of value. I think going back and playing older games, not just kind of on a surface level of like, oh, you know, check out this retro aesthetic, but actually like really engaging with like, why was this game popular, right? Like, why did people love you know, LucasArts games, right? Was it just the, you know, cute animation, or were there actually mechanics there that were making that experience pleasurable? I think that kind of thing is really useful to do for designers. And also, you know, going beyond games too, right? Like that, I think another reason Kentucky Route Zero is such a successful game is it's taking inspiration, very specific and deep inspiration from games history, but also from other things too, right? So like they were very inspired by theatrical traditions of like lighting and staging in their visual design. And there's, you know, a lot of other examples of that in that game. So looking, you know, beyond like the last 5 to 10 years of games to things other than games into the sort of deep history of games, I think is really, you know, useful and important.
Well, you're talking about the value of these things, and I guess, I don't know, yeah, I don't know. It's always weird when asked, like, oh, could you give context on who you are? Because I don't know if you, like, count yourself as a writer. I mean, obviously your games are writerly, so I don't know if this is a weird question, but just speaking about the value of things, I wonder, like, to you, like, what value does character usually seem to have in games? And what more additional depth would you maybe like to see added in like the way people think of approaching, you know, making characters and the way they exist in game worlds? That isn't too abstract for you.
No, yeah, that's a good one. So I've thought about this a lot. So in 2016, I helped co-found a company called Spirit AI that kind of had the mission of trying to bring more dynamic intelligence to games on a couple levels, but one of them specifically was Npc Characters, because there's kind of this notion that, you know, so many other parts of games, from sort of, you know, physics to rendering to even just play mechanics, have sort of evolved and improved and iterated over the years, but characters are still basically just cutscenes, right? It's like pre-recorded dialogue. It's there's not a lot of you know, sort of simulation or sort of inherently computational stuff going on in most narrative game characters, especially. But increasingly, there is technology that could start making that stuff more dynamic, right? So both text to speech and speech to text have, you know, improved drastically over the last 10 years and are starting to approach the level of what a human sounds like and what a human can understand, right? And there's also been, tons of research in academia and other places about, how do you make NPCs who seek goals? How do you come up with stories that can dynamically respond to the player with planning or, all kinds of other approaches? So we were thinking about that a lot. Like, is the time right that this could actually be sort of like a middleware product for game studios, right? Like, the analogy that I sort of liked was, so there's Speed Tree if you just want a bunch of trees but don't want to figure out how to render trees from scratch yourself.
Right.
There's opening to be like the Speed Tree of game characters, right? Like, you want an intelligent games character, but you don't want to have to go, reinvent fundamental AI from, the first principles. And it's a hard problem, right? And so one of the things we learned is that most people in the game industry don't really see that as a problem, right? It's because it's just kind of worked for 30 years, right? So why fix it if it ain't broke? But I think there's a real lack of depth in what we could be doing with characters in games that sort of has come from that attitude kind of becoming entrenched. And I think, whether it's a Spirit AI thing, whether it's some random indie coming out of nowhere, at some point, and I think it'll be relatively soon, we're going to see a really breakout indie game that has a really dynamic, responsive character, and it's going to be a real game changer in the way that, other kind of big touchstone games have been. And then everyone's going to want that, right? Everyone's going to want that in their game. But we kind of have to get to that moment where there's kind of the killer app, I think, before people will really see like how far we could still go in that realm, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to not think of Westworld, even though I know that's not really the direction that we're pointing in with this. But I wonder, and it's hard to theorize about the lack of something and sort of why prevailing attitudes are what they are. But it sounds like you did go a little bit door to door with Spirit AI, and the attitude of like, why fix it if it ain't broke, doesn't surprise me. Can you theorize a bit on sort of why people don't see it as as an opportunity? I mean, I would just sort of be theorizing that maybe there's some sort of concern that if the characters are too engaging, that it will in some way pull focus from the player.
Sure.
But I'm just I'm just talking out the side of my neck, though. But I don't really think it may just be let's not put money into that because we don't have the money, and who cares?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of things, right? I mean, I think the games industry is really risk averse, understandably, right? Because games are super expensive to make.
Yeah.
And anytime you have dynamic content, and especially the more dynamic it is, the riskier that proposition gets, right? Because you could end up as a sort of rights holder with egg on your face if something really catastrophically goes wrong or whatever. We had a lot of interesting discussions about sort of like branded characters, right? Or like characters from famous IP. And it's like, well, how can you guarantee that, this would never have this character say something like inappropriate for our brand, right? So there are very real non-trivial problems there,
right,
to figure out. But I also think it's just sort of a sense, or it's hard to imagine what that would even look like if you haven't seen it, right? Like a year before Minecraft came out, it was hard to imagine a game with that level of, creativity and flexibility existing, because that game didn't exist yet, right? But a few years later, like, there were a million clones, and well, it's like, of course, right? Like,
yeah.
why were we always making this kind of game? But it's just that thing of when you have, especially that fundamental of a sort of sea change in like what interaction would even look like. It's just hard to even picture it, even for people who are used to kind of, trying to visualize what, the next big thing is. And I think it'll be, once that tech sort of is being used and deployed, it'll be decades before people actually get to the level of like, what's a masterwork, interactive story with a dynamic character as the lead, right?
Yeah.
It'll be a whole new, field to explore.
Well, I was just gonna ask, like, is character something you feel that Yeah, if you feel like character is something that interactive fiction, like does it do that particularly well? I don't really want to focus on stumbling blocks, but I would be interested to hear on like what you feel are the particular strengths of the genre, which probably I realize contains many subgenres, but also like where maybe some of the growing pains are right now.
Yeah, so it definitely can be, but I think it's generally from the sort of brute force approach like I used in Blue Laguna, right? Which is like, let's just write, 40,000 lines of dialogue, right, for this character. But you can do that in interactive fiction in a way that's much harder to do in normal games unless you're BioWare and have a team of 50 writers working for you for 6 years or whatever. So I think people are more interested in that space in telling character-focused stories. So obviously because action is harder to do in a text format, but because I think it attracts writers and people who are more interested in kind of more contemplative kinds of stories in the first place. And I would say there's definitely a lot of text interactive fiction that is focused on character, even if it's not using sort of mechanically or algorithmically complex characters, which is also obviously a part of it is having a story that is about character to begin with. One of the things over the last more recently that community has done a lot of, which has been really interesting to me, is there's been this whole movement away from kind of more complex world models towards sort of simpler interaction paradigms and simpler mechanics. So Twine became a huge thing in the 2010s, which for anyone not familiar is a tool for making kind of hypertext-like stories. And it's much simpler under the hood than things like Inform, which was the dominant tool of the decade before that. But it's been really interesting to see the way that has both opened up sort of the kind of people who are interested in trying to make a game to like a much broader selection of people than had been willing to put up with, sort of more fiddly complex tools in the past. But also the way people have really inhabited that kind of, quote unquote, simpler paradigm and explored it in a way that feels much more rich and in-depth than people were doing with the sort of Zork-like world models of rooms and objects and simulating light sources and stuff. And I don't know whether that's just because it's kind of like a smaller canvas, so it's easier to explore the space of what you can paint on it, or whether there's more going on there. But I had always been, pre-2010, I had always thought of myself as kind of a technologist, right? Like I wanted things to be more and more complicated. We have to get, to the right complexity of tools and code such that we can tell the kinds of, truly interactive stories we always really want. But I really kind of rethought that a lot because so many people have done so many amazing things with a much simpler set of tools. So I think that's been a really interesting shift to watch happen.
I've never heard that definition of technologist. Is that a prevailing one that a person just wants to, I mean, it follows, but I know a couple people who I have described in writing as technologists, and I was like, "Uh-oh, is this what I'm saying about them?"
No, I think I started using that word. So I actually went to art school and did a bunch of digital storytelling stuff, and then later on I went to a computer science PhD and was trying to do sort of artsy stuff. So I've kind of been like had to describe it from both perspectives, and I feel like people in art school would use a word like technologist to mean like people who were obsessed with computers, more than like the output that they would provide, right? Which is definitely a swath of people for sure. But
well, I mean, so you were saying that sort of all games kind of have lessons. You said when we were emailing, the text games, tabletop games, playground games, etc., all have important lessons to share. Even if they don't generate eye-catching screenshots. And so I wonder if we've already been covering them, and if so, like what are other important lessons that text-only games can sort of offer for people to share and explore?
There's so text games and tabletop role-playing games I've both always been really interested in. Because it just that kind of game foregrounds just different things than a digital game. So in text particular, something that's really interesting about text as a medium is that it paints pictures in people's minds, but they're very interpretive pictures, right? Like two people might visualize the same sentence in completely different ways or interpret it as meaning different things. And that's true, to a certain extent of a visual medium, but it's text has a delightful kind of ambiguity about it, especially when authors sort of lean into that and deliberately, make things ambiguous. There's a game, this is kind of back to knowing game history. There's a game that's, I think, from the early 2000s, that's an interactive fiction game called 905, that the first time you play it, it seems like it's this relatively mundane thing about waking up in your apartment, realizing you're late, getting ready to go to work, kind of wandering through the house, trying to figure out where your clothes are, all this kind of stuff. You finally get out in your car and you drive to work. And when you arrive at your work, you're arrested. And this news report plays that this weird man murdered someone, then slept in his house, put on his clothes, and drove to his office to go to his job. So you replay the game, and nothing has changed about the text. But suddenly you realize all of the things that it never explicitly said the first time, right? Like it never says that it's your house. And when you're putting on the clothes, there's this comment about like, oh, these seem really nice. Yeah. That the first time you interpret it as like a comment on your own clothes. So it's like you're playing the experience of playing it a second time is you're a totally different character. Everything is totally different. And that only works, or that worked in part, right, because of the sort of textual ambiguity of the way it was written. And there's all kinds of examples of things like that you can't really do in a visual medium as effectively. So that's one thing about text specifically that I'm always really fascinated with is those sort of like word games. With tabletop role-playing games, one of the things that's really fascinating me about the sort of indie scene there is the ways people have done so much exploring and experimentation with mechanics to collaboratively tell stories together. And without the sort of necessity of it has to be an algorithm running on a computer, right? Like it can be humans doing it. There's just been all kinds of incredible things. So I'm thinking in particular of a game called, I think the full title is Polaris Chivalric Tragedy at Utmost North. It's by a designer named P.H. Lee. And it is this sort of tragic fantasy story about these sort of knights of this ancient dying civilization and how they're on this sort of ultimately hopeless quest to, defend their kingdom. But it has this central mechanic of negotiation where you and another player who is always playing the sort of forces that are trying to like pull you down and corrupt you and kill you, at sort of pivotal moments and scenes basically have this kind of ritualized negotiation where they're trying to basically get you to make as big a sacrifice as possible, and you're bargaining with them to try to sort of like save something, save something that is of value to you, even if you're, making a sacrifice or even giving up your life. And so it's this process. It's almost like bidding, but you're bidding for these sort of like emotional narrative beats. And it's so fascinating, and there's nothing like it in digital games. And I've gotten so much inspiration in the past few years out of the sort of experiments people are doing in that space. And I think that stuff is, obviously going to inform my digital games going forward. So, yeah.
I mean, are these kind of games, is there a feeling that they're sort of marginalized? Like, I don't know. I feel like I talk to a lot of people, and that's sort of the way they talk about them, or sort of the way they think other people talk about them. I don't know if it's just a feeling of like a lot of like the bigger, websites don't typically cover them, or is that not your sense of it?
Yeah, there's not as much crosstalk between those communities as it seems like there should be, right? Like between role-playing game designers and digital game designers. There are a lot of, there's a lot of overlap in fans, I think, and even in designers, there's a lot of people who are fans of both. But the sort of schools of design wisdom and practice are very sort of isolated from each other, which I think is kind of a shame, because I think in both directions, right? There's a lot of, things that can be learned.
Is it just that people don't like reading? Or is it just that people who don't like reading think that people don't like reading?
Yeah, well, so, it's more social, right? There's more logistics in getting a group of people together. I used to have a joke when I was still in grad school that the reason academics don't study role-playing games is that no academic has a 4-hour block of time when 5 of their friends are all free at the same moment. But I think that is, digital games are a more, you can play them from, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. before you go to bed on a weeknight, whereas it's harder to, get a group together to play a role-playing game consistently. So I think for a lot of people, they might want to play or might, remember, role-playing in college or whatever, but they just don't have the ability to keep doing it. So that's just sort of a, logistical factor of that kind of game. Mm-hmm. And I think too, we were talking in the email thread a bit about discovery for indie games, and that's a big problem too, right? I think I don't have any solid numbers about this, but I would expect there are a large number of people who think, Dungeons and Dragons is the only role-playing game and aren't aware that there are others that have been created, right? Let alone where to find them or who to play them with, right? So I think a lot of those games, like a lot of good indie games, although maybe even worse because I don't think there's a platform with the kind of reach that Steam has, for example, are just, kind of languishing in a bit of obscurity, which is a shame.
Right. Well, and there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there of, in the case of someone who's only ever heard of D&D, if presented with something else, the sort of rejoinder of well, if this was any good, wouldn't I have heard of it?
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of, it's kind of socially risky to role play, especially if you're going to try to play a game that you don't know what to expect from it, right? Because you're being asked to be creative or to improvise or to be vulnerable in some way in front of a group of people. And I think a lot of people, even who play D&D, that seems like a stressful proposition. So
yeah.
And I think some of the best games in that space that have gotten some traction. So there's a game called Fiasco that kind of, broke out a bit 5 or 6 years ago and got a little bit of recognition. I think part of the reason that they work is that they're very explicit about kind of setting things up and giving people permission to be silly or to kind of let loose, rather than, the sense that they're going to be judged or that they're not going to be creative enough to play or whatever. So I think there's a real art in kind of expectation setting for that kind of game.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess maybe the only other one I've heard of that really sort of crossed over was Depression Quest, which was a couple of years ago, and I guess arguably maybe didn't wholly cross over because of the game, but other things surrounding it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I think, back in digital games, right, trying a text-only game or trying a game that is, going to be about something, challenging, we have, I think, much more of a built-up cultural norm that, it's okay to go see a movie that's going to be really depressing and is going to make you cry. But I think a lot of people don't want that experience from a game, right? And that's not, I don't think that's a failing of individual people. It's just sort of, we don't have that cultural tradition of, this is a way you can, encounter this kind of story or this kind of experience.
Right. Well, kind of peripheral to this, I asked you on email, what do people who champion games have wrong about them? And you mentioned that there's a tendency, people can be unapologetic about violence and sort of there being a huge focus on how pretty they are, which is true. I think, I was just thinking about this, just knowing we were going to talk and thinking about this question, new consoles have been announced and no one has sort of said, oh, these games are too pretty or they're turned off because of how pretty they are. But the violence thing is a persistent thing, I find, for people over a certain age. And, it can be a thing where, you just feel kind of gross, like playing stuff like that and then feeling gross with, the ability to sort of overlook it. And then I have these conversations with friends of mine where it's well, how do you criticize violence in games without seeming prudish, or is it less like a critic's job and more like a fight for developers to sort of like light a better way in their work instead? Because I always feel like I don't know. It just comes across as like it's hard to criticize, even though on the face of it, you look at it, it shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mentioned in my email, I think in gaming culture, a lot of that came out of the 90s when, Congress people started trying to censor games and using violence as an excuse for that. And so gamer culture kind of developed this notion of like, even suggesting that a game is too violent or that, a game where all you do is shoot people is bad, is like anathema, right? Because that road is the road to, your games being taken away from you or whatever. But yeah, I think that is kind of a shame because I think there are so many other things games could be about than shooting.
Literally every other thing.
Literally, yeah, every other part of the human experience. And for that to have, as we saw in this last decade, again, become kind of like a culture war with huge swaths of gamers saying, games that are about those other parts of the human experience aren't real games, or the people who make them aren't real gamers or whatever, is such a shame. And I think it has really kind of, it inhibits the growth of gaming as a medium, and it inhibits the, ability of people to tell interesting stories with it. Yeah, like I liked more actiony games when I was younger, but yeah, the older I get, the more, all the games I've gotten into in the last couple of years have been about building stuff, right? Like or exploring. I got really into No Man's Sky when that came out. I've been playing a game called Satisfactory for the last year, which is sort of like a perfect mental candy for me because it's about like planning and building big complex factories, but it's also set in a big like open 3D world where you have to go explore to find new resource nodes or whatever. So that's the kind of thing I'm drawn to when I'm not playing more explicitly story games. Yeah. And I don't know. I think. Yeah, I don't know whether that is something that gaming will eventually grow out of, if that's just sort of inherent in the same way that like Hollywood blockbusters are the biggest grossing, movies. But it does seem like, especially at certain points in Hollywood history, like I think we're kind of seeing this right now with Netflix, and in like the 70s, there was kind of a wave of more, intellectual kind of thinky movies. There have been periods where it's sort of been like okay to do other kinds of things with that medium, and it'll be interesting to see if, whether it's indie games getting more legitimacy or new kinds of, the analogy I always really like is a lot of big studios have their like art house labels, right? And like I really want to see, more like, what is EA's equivalent of, a Fox Searchlight movie, right? So.
Well, I mean, that's another thing too, and I think you brought that up too, which is just sort of you were talking about like it's just. I mean, no, it's an old axe to grind, which doesn't make it any less worthy of grinding. Which is just sort of like you were talking about your disappointment on how games have kind of evolved to use Hollywood movies as their ideal template to emulate. And I guess I often wonder, like, is it fair to say big budget movies are able to be more meaningful than big budget games? Like in other words, like are we wrong to sort of hope for like the equivalent in games of like Michael Bay with nuance? Is it like, are we just sort of asking a thing to not be the thing that it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, so like in Hollywood, you'll get movies like you get action movies and dumb comedies and stuff. But I mean, you also get things like, like La La Land winning Best Picture a couple years ago, or Moonlight, right? Or you get stuff that feels to me much broader of a range than the stuff that is, the top grossing and sort of most talked about games. Yeah, you're starting to see, like you see in gaming awards, a lot of more innovative games are getting noticed. But but like it feels like we're a long way away from, like the game equivalent of a, Martin Scorsese movie or something being like one of the top selling games of the year. So I think part of that too is just Hollywood has had a lot longer to mature as an industry, right? And develop, audiences of different kinds and everything.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting as far as like using it as a model. And I kind of was, alluding to this earlier. It's like games can be very good interactive movies, but they can also be very different kinds of things. And it would be cool to see, that being explored in a more mainstream way. I've had this thing of, and this came out of submitting a lot of my games to game festivals, which always want like a screenshot and a video and everything. And a lot of my games don't really make for good screenshots.
Right.
But just thinking like, what if there was like a festival for ugly games, right? What if there was a festival where like a screenshot wasn't the thing that convinced people whether they should click on your game or not, right? What if, what if we used as our criteria like something totally other than like visual appearance, right? And it's like, it's just an idea, but it just feels like that's really becomes a template for what like a quote unquote real game is, or what kind of game people will spend $60 on or whatever, and it's kind of limiting in a lot of ways.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, like what? Not that like tropes are inherently bad, but like what tropes are you kind of exhausted by in those sort of big budget games? But I wonder if instead like, maybe what tropes are you exhausted by in the way that people talk about these games?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, I think you see something you see a lot of is. So games are weird, right? Because they have all of these different levels, right? There's the level of the story, there's the level of the visuals, there's the level of the mechanics and the gameplay. And I think it's actually really rare to see reviews or commentary that talks about all those things kind of together, right? Like holistically. And I think that's a shame because like good games, I think, are always the ones that are sort of like marrying those elements together really well, right? So for me, it's really surreal, and this was 5 or 6 years ago now, but like a game like BioShock Infinite, which to me had such this bizarre like disconnect between like the kind of like story that it wanted to tell and the actual gameplay of it. But most of the reviews were, like incredibly positive and, gushing about how great the visuals were or how, compelling the gameplay was or whatever. But it felt to me like they weren't really like looking at all of that together holistically and looking at it at the level of like, what is this game actually about? And when I say about, right, I don't just mean the story. I mean, what are its mechanics about, right? Like, what is the game as a whole system about? And we talked about how, games journalism is often really shallow because games journalists often don't, have the resources to actually, get into that kind of level of critique. But I guess, I think what I'm really trying to say is like reviewing or speaking about a game, I think is actually a lot harder than talking about a movie or an album or something, with less kind of individual moving parts. And I think some of the really meaty, I'd like to see more of that kind of meaty games criticism that kind of looks at works more holistically like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you say the word meaty because I think it's about as hard as writing about food because it's such an intangible thing that everyone has an opinion about. Yeah, trying to retrace my steps here, but I think you mentioned in our emails, and I was just curious if you could elaborate on this. You were talking about, like, rather than movies in the 80s, games may have used books instead to emulate. And I guess I wasn't sure, like, what you were referring to, but I would be interested to hear more and, like, how they sort of, how it was so close to being in their grasp and, like, how books sort of drifted away from being the template.
Yeah, so this is near and dear to my heart, and this is also part of the research I've been doing. So yeah, there was this really fascinating time around like 1983 to 1985 where the best-selling games were text adventures because computer graphics at that point were just like laughably primitive, and Infocom famously had this ad. With a scan of a human brain, and I think the text was something like, "We stick our graphics where the sun don't shine," and the notion was like, what you can imagine in your head from reading, their beautiful prose is like so much better than the like Space Invaders graphics you're going to get on a state-of-the-art computer system. But what started happening as a result of this was all of these big publishing companies started thinking, oh, maybe games are the future. And so right in that pretty short period, it was about an 18-month kind of mini boom. Random House and Simon & Schuster and all these publishing companies started trying to get their authors to collaborate on games. And kind of the most famous example of this was Douglas Adams made a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game with Infocom, but all kinds of authors, James Clavell, there were adaptations of, public domain things like Jules Verne and Robin Hood and stuff. But lots of big name authors at least had their names put on the boxes. Well, where they screwed up is that they didn't really understand that writing and making a text adventure were like different skill sets. So there was kind of legendarily disastrous example where the science fiction author Thomas M. Dish, who I like a lot, and a lot of his novels are really meaningful to me, basically got convinced to write a game for his publisher as his next project. So he wrote this 600-page screenplay, basically, that actually was fairly had a lot of thought put into it about if the player does this should happen or whatever. But then he just sort of checked out. He's like, well, I wrote it, I'm done. The publisher turned it over to a programmer and said, can you just kind of implement this game that was written for us by Thomas M. Dish? Not really understanding that actually designing and building the game, was a thing that involved skills and time and all of that stuff. And so the game that came out was kind of disastrous because they sort of tried to use all of these pieces of content, but there wasn't a game there in the original design, right? It was like a screenplay essentially.
Right.
So and a ton of these authors weren't really involved at all, even on the level of writing any prose. So all of these games were terrible, and none of them sold well. And then by 1985, 86, computer graphics started getting a little better. You had EGA 16-color games started coming out, and Infocom, sort of by the end of the 80s, had kind of folded as graphical games became the best-selling things. But it's really fascinating to me that there was this little moment where everyone was like, oh, wow, maybe interactive books is going to be the future of entertainment on computers, and maybe that's what we should be investing in and everything. So, yeah, it's interesting that that's a fairly forgotten story today, because, again, I think once you get into a dominant mindset, it's hard to imagine that things could have worked any other way. But it's there's some parallel reality out there where all of,
Right.
Today's big-name authors are writing these compu novels was a big buzzword at that in publishing industries at that time. Everyone would be writing compu novels in the future. So
hard to imagine with a buzzword like that, it didn't take off. I mean, I was familiar with some of those authors and games you're talking about, but I didn't realize that there was an active outreach and I guess money being put down to sort of seed that. I'm surprised at how buried that's been then.
Yep. One of those weird little stories in gaming history.
Huh. Well, I guess semi-relatedly, I mean, you had mentioned that fans of tabletop role-playing games and also indie books are much, much nicer than, I guess, certain groups of fans, let's say, in video games. So I'm curious, what are examples of things that, never happen in those circles that are more commonplace in digital games, as you call them?
Yeah, I mean, I think... So, one of the big differences is it's a lot harder when you're writing a tabletop role-playing rule book to or it's a lot less common to have to stay up all night debugging it right before your release day.
Right.
So it's a less painful process to develop that kind of game, and because of that, because you actually have control over the output in a more direct way than you do over a game's output, you can have sort of like a greater amount of confidence that, what you're delivering is going to work as intended and everything. So there's sort of that level, right, there are bugs in tabletop role-playing games, but they're experientially very different than computer game bugs that can, cause your whole game to stop running or whatever. There's also, though, a sort of attitude problem, and I don't really know where it comes from, but I feel like in the space of indie tabletop games, there's still much more of a sense of like the audience being like pleased that you made this game for them, right? Wow, this is really cool. Thank you for making this. This is great. The last couple sort of digital games I involved with, it seemed like the fan communities were much more toxic, right? Like the most vocal people, were berating you for having a political message in your game, whether you actually intended them to be reading that part of the game in that way or not, were, constantly complaining that your game isn't running on, why isn't this on the Switch? Why isn't this on, Xbox? And just, I don't know whether it's just a volume question, right? Like there are so many more digital games fighting for people's attention, whereas tabletop games are relatively rarer. But I just found the last couple digital games I made just really draining because I felt like I put so much work and effort into making them, and not most, but a lot of the feedback I got was unpleasant, right? It was not creatively renewing or fulfilling to me, whereas I've encountered just the opposite with tabletop games. I get tons of positive feedback. I get, I feel like I brought something good into the world by making that and releasing that. So yeah, it feels weird to say it because I've identified as a digital games maker for such a long time. But I have a bit of a contact aversion to getting back into it now because of the and it's not just that, right? There's my last game in particular had all kinds of sort of platform distribution issues with Apple. We won an Indicate award. And then when it was about to come out, Apple said it couldn't be on the App Store for violating this rule that other games were also violating. So anyway, there was this whole unpleasant experience with that. So basically when I think about going back and making a new digital game, I'm like, oh man, it's going to be a big pain in the ass. But I'm sure I'll return eventually. But
yeah, I mean, there's a question sometimes I ask people who make games, and I guess it would make sense to ask here, which is like, why do it to yourself again? Basically, like after you've made one game, especially, because like you work in other media and like you have other you can decide to do different things with your ideas. And so I guess I'm always curious, like how is it in your head that, like, you realize like, oh, this would be, this type of game. But I also do wonder about just the sheer amount of work that's involved, like why people choose to do it again. But then there are also these, I think, fairly known headwinds of, certain vocal portions, however small, however their volume actually is. Like, I guess I'm just curious, like, discounting that or not, like, when you do make a game, like, why do you decide to do another, and how do you know that the idea is in fact, a game and not just a novel or something?
Yeah, and I mean, I think for most people, and I think this is true for me too, it just goes back to like, it's about that idea, right? Like, yeah. I think when I do make a new digital game, it's going to be because I have an idea and I'm like, oh wow, there's no other way to do this than as a digital game, and I'll get excited enough about it to, roll up my sleeves and open up a new bug tracker and start, start on the process. Yeah, I mean, I think digital games people have so much passion, right? Because it is such a slog to make even a small game, and just deal with, everything from platform issues to bug reports to, it's a whole thing. And the fact that there are, so many passionate people making so many amazing games, I think, those are all labors of love.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I hear it more in TV and other things, but rarely in games, that there's not that understanding that, like, hey, no one is, like, setting out to make a bad game.
Yeah. I think it's much more common for people to kind of like, I sort of wrote a novel on evenings and weekends, but it's not very good. You shouldn't read it. Like, I think games people are much more like, you should play my new game because I put a lot into it.
Yeah, it's like,
I think it's more of an active hobby.
It's like it's NaNoWriMo all year long or something.
Yeah.
So I have a couple more here for you. I guess, like, I don't know, like, I guess just for all video games in general, like, do you have a sense of like who do you feel like is like the most invisible audience, or like what types of people are games not reaching that they could, and why do you think that is?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, so there's a couple, obvious answers, right? Like older people, have historically never really been targeted for games. I think that might start to change as like an increasing number of people who, identify themselves as gamers, are aging into that category.
Right.
One of the things that's always been interesting to me writing text games is that they're accessible to blind people who, are shut out of huge chunks of other kinds of games. So one of my very first games, actually, I got contacted a little while after it came out by a company that was making a Braille reader targeted at sort of like kids and young adults, and they wanted to include some text games on it and wanted to know if they could include mine. And they didn't have any money to license it or whatever. I was like, yeah, sure, that's fine. And that game, I would get like fan mail for that game for like the next, I think, 12 or 15 years, because they just kept it on that platform, each version. So it reached so many people who, enjoyed it so much because it was a game that they were able to play, right? And because of that experience, that made me, just think a lot about how those games are sort of interesting to me intellectually, and as a writer and a reader, right, I really like text games, but it's also sort of like an existential thing for a portion of that fan base. Is if people stop making those games, that's, kind of like a whole world of gameplay that goes away for them. So things like accessibility, right, and making sure, your game can run under a screen reader, I think are important things that often get overlooked. Other kinds of audiences that are underserved, I think I'm starting to feel like one of those audiences increasingly.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
So I used to, really love 40-hour RPGs when I was in college, and now that just seems like a chore, right? Like I don't want to spend 40 hours slugging through the main quest line. So games that you can just pick up and put down, and maybe it's been 3 months and you've forgotten the plot, but that's okay. Heaven's Vault by Inkle, which is an incredible game. One of the many things that it did that I liked a lot is it has this feature where when you load a save game, it has a sort of dynamic summary of the plot so far that's sort of assembled based on, what you've seen. And it might even, I don't know if it factors in how long it's been since you've played, but it basically gives you this like totally personalized little like 1 to 2 paragraph summary of the story so far. And that was so great to just like go back in and remember like, oh, right, like this character is doing this and this is where I am. And that's great. So that's sort of like, story games, but for casual players, right? There's casual games as a whole thing, but like I would like to play an epic 40-hour RPG, but maybe like I don't want to do as much combat grinding, and I'd like some help remembering what the plot is, right? Things like that I'd love to see more of.
Yeah. Trevor Noah, who I guess hosts the Daily Show now, a couple of years ago, he had this tweet that video games should rename their difficulties part-time job, full-time job, and unemployed. Which, as the years go on, comes to mind more and more. But also, yeah, I mean, I did play Heaven's Vault, and I totally forgot that it did that like previously on thing, which is so nice. Yep. And I'm like, how come no other game I've played has ever done that, yep. or just even been like, here's a refresher of what the controls are.
It has been really nice too. I think you're seeing more and more games being okay with kind of alternative models of playing them, right? So there's been like a transition away from like having a game with like, you know, hardcore mode and wuss mode to like, difficult mode and casual mode, right? And then things like the Assassin's Creed games with their sort of exploration modes that let you just like hang out in the massive, you know, immaculately detailed historical world they've created. That's really cool, and I would love to see more of that kind of thing happening, because I think it's just, I mean, to me, it seems like it makes financial sense, right? Because you're expanding the audience of people who are going to be interested in playing your game. But it's also just sort of interesting because I think games, especially a game, you know, like one of those Assassin's Creed games, like they are big enough and complex enough to contain multitudes, right? Like they can encompass totally different styles of play, and I think it'll be awesome to see if studios, you know, embrace that more and more.
Well, so you were talking about Cardboard Computer a while back, and I guess I'm just curious, like, if there's a developer or a group of developers or maybe like a scene of people who you feel is sort of like, you know, really getting it right now, or maybe kind of serving as a bit of your North Star, and like, I don't know, like if there's something kind of everyone who makes games or everyone who plays games can maybe, you know, learn from the way they're approaching them.
Yeah. So I really admire Inkle. I think I mentioned them earlier.
Yeah.
Because I think they do a really great job at making like really polished, professional quality gameplay experiences, but also always trying to innovate and try new things and sort of push the medium of interactive story forward. So their new upcoming game, uses this sort of like chess-like mechanic to let you explore this dynamic narrative. And I just love that everything they do is kind of experimenting and trying something new. That's really awesome to see. And then I guess another person I would give a shout out to is Squinky, who's a sort of game artist whose games are always bring new ideas of what can games make you think about and feel about. So they did a game. Actually, they went to grad school with me, and while we were both there, they did a game that was an interactive theater piece where the people on stage were doing a play about being on a first date, and each of the people had a phone that was like feeding them their lines, but then they each had little interactive like dialogue trees, so they could choose what they wanted to say next. And the choices got presented on the screen behind them. So it created this like amazing combination of like the awkwardness of the first date with the awkwardness of like trying to navigate an interactive story where you're not sure like which choices are going to get you the ending you want, with this sort of audience participation element. And each of their games is like doing something new and weird and interesting. So I'm a big fan of their work. There's so many people. I'll stop there.
Well, we could have started there easily, I think. So I have just one last question for you here, which is intentionally broad and just whatever first comes to mind. What do you think video games have accomplished?
Oh, wow. That's a big one. In the course of their history as a medium?
I don't know. People, I mean, it's intentionally opaque, not to be coy, but just, I'm curious, like, you know, people have answered it, like, for them personally, what they feel on a cosmic sense, what they feel for a species. I guess I'm curious in, like, the gut reaction, which is sort of why I'm blabbing at you extra wordy here to let you
Yeah.
connect with whatever your gut feeling was.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I feel like I have aspirations for what games could be. Well, I'll just go with this because I think some games, are achieving this. I think gaming, because it is so like directly interactive, can potentially be so powerful for sort of altering your experiential, the way you relate to a concept or a period of history or a particular character. Because if you're becoming them and sort of, walking in their shoes, that's different than watching a movie. It's different than reading a book, even a book written in first person or second person. So, a lot of my most powerful game experiences have been things that, changed how I thought about something through the process of, enacting that person's actions or making decisions as that person. Sort of like one random example, there was a game maybe 10 years ago that got a decent amount of press that was about trying to live on minimum wage. So you went through 30 days and you had a budget that was your how much money you made that month. And every day I had to make these decisions about, well, are you going to, buy the toy your kid wants? Are you going to make your car payment, or are you going to go to the grocery store, right? And the experience of doing that day by day and you being the one making those choices and responsible for that, really hit me in a different way than I think, reading statistics or even reading a personal report. So, I mean, to me, that's what I think games do so well is they're our own, early 21st century holodecks, right? Like they let us experience another point of view in a different way than previous media have. So that's kind of thing I'm really interested to see them continue to explore throughout the rest of this century.